Paul had specifically requested that Charles sing that song. I think it meant a lot to Paul. I want to share the obituary with you because if you're like I am, you went to read it, and Paul's life was so full. If he had lived one more month, he would have been 98. You do a lot in 98 years. He probably did twice as much as most who would be so blessed to live 98 years. Paul Goble, born January 1924, passed away last month, November the 2nd. He was born the second of 5 children to Carl and Ellen Goble in Guyman, Oklahoma. He was raised on a farm in the Oklahoma Panhandle. He grew up with an appreciation for farm animals and wildlife. Early on, his family and he discovered his gift for running, fixing, and adapting machinery of all types, a gift that carried him throughout his life. When Paul was 11 years old, his mother was disabled by a lightning strike, which left her paralyzed on her left side. The children assumed the household duties when she regained her strength, and Paul became the household cook. His family endured the Depression years that were followed by the dirty 30s on the prairie, and by the age of 16, he convinced his father to sign for him to join President Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps. He was stationed here in western Colorado. Got Oklahoma on my mind, and I have actually been to Guyman and have preached in the Nazarene Church in Guyman, but he came to western Colorado, where he was stationed. When some of his duties included teaching young recruits to drive over the $1 Million Highway while it was being constructed, he wouldn't have gotten me on that. A watershed project for water storage for the Grand Valley, and work on the Mancos Reservoir. His main duties were maintenance of heavy equipment as a mechanic and the management of a camp post exchange in Mancos, Colorado. From his time in the CCC, he enlisted directly into the U.S. Marine Corps at the age of 18 and spent his enlistment in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Again, he served as a heavy equipment operator and as a driver who delivered supplies and ordnance to the front lines and brought back the wounded and dead to base camp. He saw combat in New Guinea, Camp Gloucester, New Britain, Peleliu, Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands, and joined in the Allied occupation of China. When he returned home in 1946, he met and married Betty Lou Derrick in Guyman, Oklahoma. They moved to Grand Junction in 1954, where he found work as a mechanic at the Laycock Motor Company. He and Betty bought a brand new home on 30 Road. In 1957, the family moved to Uravan, Colorado, where Paul worked as a heavy equipment mechanic on Union Carbide vehicles used in the mining and milling of uranium. They returned to their home on 30 Road after 18 months. Paul was known for his kindness and his willingness to repair cars and anything else that needed fixing, especially for people who could not afford going to a repair shop. He worked many late hours in his yard and home shop, often rebuilding broken parts that he knew would be too expensive for someone to buy brand new. He and Betty opened their home to fostering children for several years. His children remember his ability to fix or make toys, how he could give each character in the Sunday Funnies his own personality as he read to a lap full of kids, how he kept restless children occupied in church by making tiny sailboats out of scraps of paper. They learned about compassion, integrity, problem solving, and faith. He chose to give his talent and services to his church as he took care of general repairs, the HVAC system, served on the church board, taught junior boys Sunday school, and much more. He often shared that he felt his job in life was to take care of the widows and orphans because that's what Jesus said to do. Paul and Betty's family included 6 children. one of whom died in infancy. 6 grandchildren, 11 great-grandchildren, and 8 great-great-grandchildren. He is preceded in death by his parents, 3 brothers, John, James, and Leland, his wife, Betty, who died 5 years ago this month, daughters, Betty Paulette and Deanna Atwood, and grandson, Jonathan Atwood. He is survived by his sister, Doris Ferguson, daughters, Mary Garner and Carla Atwood, and son, William Goble. And I believe, Mary, you have a letter you would like to read.
Got it. I didn't tell Bill I was going to do this. You know, as we sort through stuff, we find things that we didn't know existed. This letter was written shortly after Mom passed away. And it was written to Dad. And there's a paragraph in here that I'd like to read because it honors Dad, and I'll do my best not to get weepy. I miss Mom, but I'm okay. I find comfort in the fact that I can talk to her every day now, and that I have one more guardian angel up in heaven that's going to speak on my behalf. But just so you know, I talk to you every day as well. I'm glad she went peaceful and that it wasn't drawn out. And Dad, I want you to know, 10 or 15 years from now, when it's your turn, I'll be okay. I am the man that you and Mom and the girls can be proud of. You are an excellent role model, and if there's ever a question as to which path to take in life, which is very seldom there's a question, I just smile and take the path you would take, and everything works out fine. Thank you for teaching me how to be a man. And then he shares something we had all been praying for. He had put his papers in for clemency. And we have him home in time to spend time with Dad.
One of the things that was left out of the obituary was in the 70s, Paul worked for an appliance repair company. Actually, they sold appliances too. I was fresh out of the Army. Had kind of a mediocre job. And Paul says, how about coming to work for Row Appliance with me? Well, I had no experience on doing appliances. I was fairly handy with my hands. He went out and bought my first tool set, which I still have probably all of those tools today, and some of them I probably use on a fairly regular basis. What a man. What a man. The heritage. You know, you as family members have so much heritage from me. But without what he did for me, I'm not sure I would be where I am today. So, thank you, Paul.
And it's good to see all of our little Sunday school kids grown up in here.
Some of them are a little hard to recognize.
I know it. We love you.
This is the lighthouse. on a hillside that overlooks life's sea. When I'm tossed, it sends out a light that I might see, and the light that shines in darkness now will safely lead us o'er. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, my ship would be no more. Everybody that lives around us says, tear that lighthouse down. The big ships don't sail this way anymore. No use of it standing ground. Then my mind goes back to that stormy night when just in time I saw the light. Yes, the light from that old lighthouse standing on the hill. And I thank God for the lighthouse. I owe my life to Him, for Jesus is the lighthouse, and from the rocks of sin He has shown the light around me, that I can clearly see. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, where would this ship be? And I thank God for the lighthouse. I owe my life to Him, for Jesus is the lighthouse, and from the rocks of sin He has shown the light around me, that I can clearly see. If it wasn't for the lighthouse, where would this ship be?
Thank you, Robert and Janet. One thing that I just thoroughly enjoy doing around a death and a funeral is gathering with the family prior to the service and letting them share stories of the life of their loved one. I learn a lot about our people, of course, as a pastor, but I learn so much more in those sessions, and I've even learned something about the Bible today, and I've been preaching for over 50 years. I told Carla, I said, now how do you pronounce his middle name? I've never heard that name. One of King David's relatives, did you say? Okay, now I'm going to have to go back and find that. But I learned a lot, and one thing that I often ask is, did the deceased have a favorite Bible story or verse of Scripture? If so, I'll use that for the basis of my comments. And they shared right away. Yes, he loved that scripture that says, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Let me read the context of that. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. Now, those of you that knew Paul well, doesn't that sound just like him? A very contented soul. He was the biggest small parishioner I've ever had. Small in stature, but huge in spirit, in influence, in impact on the lives of others. And this scripture, I think, gives the secret as to why he was so big in the eyes of those who knew him. He knew how to be content. He realized that as long as he relied on God for his knowledge and his strength, he could do everything he needed to do through that strength that God gave him. And in knowing Paul and in meeting with the family, I got to thinking about the things that seemed to come out in all of the stories that they shared with me. And I tried to kind of boil them down to a handful of things. Paul was content with his family. Some men are not content with their family and they just leave at a whim. Not Paul Goble. Matter of fact, he and Betty were married for 70 years at the time she died. If she had lived until today, until last month when Paul passed, it would have been 75 years. That's a long, long time. And to me, it speaks of his contentedness with his family. I have no doubt he and Betty might have had one or two arguments or disagreements in that time. Maybe one or two strong disagreements. Very intense discussions. But he was content with his family, stayed with it. I understand they met in an alley in Guyman, Oklahoma. Alley cat, one of them. He was throwing some clothes away. And she was getting in practice to be a wife. She began to chastise him. Why are you not saving the buttons? He was throwing the shirts away with the buttons on them. You don't do that. You can reuse those buttons. And so it began with the two of them. Together they began to remove the buttons, and a bond was formed that turned into love. 70 years. He was rightly proud of and content in the presence of his children. From the first day I met this family, and when I came as pastor, you know, it takes a little while to put everybody together and figure out who belongs to whom and in what relationship. But from the very first day, I could sense the love and the respect that Carla and Mary had for him and the reciprocal love he had for them. And Bill, every time, without fail, when I visited in his home, he spoke lovingly of you. And when I finally got to meet you, I felt I already knew you because of your dad. And he always told me, Bill's going to be all right because we have a big God. Wow, that's confidence and contentment. He was also content with his abilities. He was a proud Marine. This flag is not draped over his coffin by accident. He was a Marine, a proud Marine. I had a cousin who was a Marine, and his dad was in the Army, and my cousin Jerry would always tell me that he was the best one. He said, you know, you joined the Army, and you joined the Navy, and you joined the Air Force, but you are a Marine. My condolences and apologies to those of you that were in the Army, Navy, or Air Force, or Coast Guard, or any of the others. That's just what they tell me. That's just what they tell me. But he was a proud Marine, as we said, served in the Pacific Theater and in China and several other places that were listed in the obituary. And when the Marines wanted to promote him, do you know he didn't want to be promoted? But they promoted him anyhow. He loved working with his hands and doing what he did well because God had given him a special and wonderful ability. But they saw something in him that he probably couldn't see in himself. They saw leadership abilities, and when he left the Marines, he was a corporal. They didn't want leadership ability like that to go to waste. They did a good job with him. With only an 8th grade education, his motto was, learn everything about what you're doing. You never know when you'll need that knowledge. That came in handy when the family's tractor broke down. He was still a young lad at home. His dad was going to go to town and get the mechanic and bring him back to fix the tractor, and he told the boys, don't touch that tractor while I'm gone. That evening he got back home, and Paul and his brother were in big trouble. Big trouble. Because the tractor was fixed. And the whole field had been plowed. And he was in trouble because he disobeyed his dad. Oh, he was confident and content. He knew he could put it back together, and he did. And I think I remember you told me he helped pave and widen that $1 million highway. I don't like that highway. I feel a little bit better about it knowing he worked on it, but man alive, I'll go to California and around to get to Texas if I have to, if I can avoid that $1 million highway. I don't like it. I don't like being a passenger in it and looking down over. Oof. When we moved here from Oklahoma City, the fellow driving the 53-foot rig left Oklahoma City to pick up a load in Albuquerque, and he said, I've always heard how beautiful southwest Colorado is, so he decided he would take that route. Check the map. The map didn't tell him the whole story. I said, how'd you like it? He said, I didn't. I said, you're going to take another truckload around there? Not on your life. But he said it was fun watching the eyes of people coming around a couple of those corners when they saw me. He said that made the trip worth it. Wow. He loved a challenge. You know he loved a challenge. He took on a class of, now I didn't name them this, his daughters did, rowdy junior high boys. I understand the fellow that just sang was in that class. Is that right? And I think, was Richard, were you in that class? There were several names they threw out, and I said, wow, Paul did like a challenge, didn't he? But hey, it turned out great, and I'm sure their lives were impacted in a way they will never get over as long as they lived. He loved a challenge. Well, he not only was content with his family and with the abilities that God had given him, he was content with God. I loved visiting with him because he was so practical. Oh, he could talk religion. He knew the vocabulary, and he'd taught, been in the church, been a part of this church. I think I remember seeing that he joined this church in 1960, I think is what we have on the books. That sound about right? So, long time ago. But his relationship with God and his confidence in God was what motivated and helped him in his labor on this earth. He said, if man made it, man can fix it with God's help. In his late 30s. This is a story I only learned the other day. I never knew it while he was still alive, but in his late 30s, when the congregation worshiped down on the corner of 10th and Grand, I guess it was, He would bring his kids to Sunday school and church and caravans and such as that. And he would go outside and have a smoke. And he said he was out there one day and there was an ant going by, and he just stepped on and squashed that ant. And he said he heard a voice as clear as a bell saying, "I can do that to you." That's how he learned experientially about the sovereignty of God. God didn't say he would. God's not an unkind God, but God just letting Paul know, hey, don't get too big for your britches. I can do that to you. He knew it was the voice of God, and he gave his heart completely and totally to the Lord and served God by serving people and by serving our church. A lot of work on this building that he did. And I'm sure there was a lot of work on the building down at 10th and Grand. When I came here, one of the first visits I made to his house, somebody told me there was some kind of a problem in the boiler room upstairs, and said, you need to go see Paul Goble about that. I said, all right, I'll do that. And I went to see Paul, and Paul said, well, I tell you what. He said, next time I'm over at the church, he said, I'll get up in the boiler room up in the attic, and you can come with me, and I'll show you exactly. He said, I'll do it, but he said, I'll teach you. I said, no way. What do you mean, no way? I said, no way that we're going to do that. He said, don't tell me you're going to be like our previous pastor. What do you mean like the previous? He said he got to the place he wouldn't let me climb up those stairs. Now, some of you know what I'm talking about, the stairs back there. They're against the wall inside that room there and against the wall, and you just go straight up. They don't lean. You go straight up and back down. And I said, Paul, he said, Pastor Larry would not let me go up there. And I said, I'm not going to let you go up there either. He said, well, I don't know if I like you either then. My first winter as pastor of this church, at the first snowfall, we had a fairly good snow for western Colorado, as I remember. My wife said there probably won't be a whole lot of folks in church today, and I said, well, probably not, but you work with what you have, and you preach to who's there, and if there's 3 people or 300, that's all right, whatever. Coming down 28 Road, and the first car I saw was a white Cadillac out there in its usual spot. I said, will you look at there? Paul Goble is here. Now, Paul Goble is here. What was he, 93 or so, something right around there, 92, 3, somewhere. I said, if he's there, he takes away almost any excuse any of the rest of us would have for not being it. You know, a lot of folks wouldn't go to church. They'd stay home, stay in front of the fireplace, get the hot cocoa, coffee, whatever, and just YouTube it. Not Paul. He was a meticulous record keeper. I started to go back there the other day, and I just didn't have time, but I was going to go up in the attic just again to refresh, to remind myself of his meticulous record keeping. When I came here, there were notepads, and I think they're all, at least as far as I know, all still up there in the penthouse, up in the attic, boiler room, with his notations on it. He's got dates when he fixed this implement or that piece or another one, and when he bought this or that or the other, when he had one of the machines serviced. He didn't have them serviced, he serviced them. And he has meticulous records. I think we could go back probably to the day this church was built, this building, anyhow, 25 years ago, and probably find up until 4, 5, 6 years ago, we could follow the record of the repair work done in this building. Meticulous records. His daughters told me he was like that at home. Said he kept records. of everything, wrote it down. Well, the most meticulous record keeper of all, God, has kept an indisputable account of Paul's life. If I wanted to know more about Paul, I probably just could have gone straight to God and said, hey, tell me about Paul. I'd love to know about him. He's an interesting character. God said, well, you go meet him. You get to know him. You'll find out how interesting he is. But God, you've got all the records. And he knows about you and me too. He's got the record on your life and my life. I don't know if that's encouraging or discouraging to you, but he's got the record. And I believe God's conclusion is that which is penned in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus said, his master said unto him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I know because I've been keeping the record, God says. You've been faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. God's meticulous record keeping. Paul's probably looking over the books now, just to make sure God didn't miss anything, especially on the right side of the ledger. But we know where he is. The scriptures tell us that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And I have no doubt of where Paul Goble is today, where his spirit is. It is with God, whom he served so faithfully, from a crushed ant and a voice saying, I can do that to you, until the final. When I first came here, I said, Paul, you're almost 100 years old. You're going to make it. Yes, he said, I'm going to make it. It seemed to be a goal. He said, yes, I'm going to. I talked to some people and I don't want to. The last 2, 3, 4 times I went to visit him, I would remind him, Paul, you're getting closer. You'll be 98 in just a few months now. Just 2 more years and a couple of months. The last time that I went to see him, while he was still conscious and aware, he said, I don't think so. He said, preacher, I'm tired. I'm tired, and I'm ready to go home. I said, Paul, you don't want to make it to 100? He said, what's it going to matter? After I'm there a couple of years, count it 100 if you want to. It'd be all right. He's at home with his Lord today. I've shared from a pastoral perspective this afternoon and shared some things that have been shared with me, as well as some things that I have observed and learned firsthand about him. I asked his family if they would like to have an open mic session this afternoon where different ones share a memory. And you can understand when I ask you to keep it as brief as possible. But Mary is going to start, and I think she has a poem to read, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe it's in the inside of the folder here if you want to follow along and listen. And then Mary, after you have read that, I'm going to ask family members who would like to share to come, and Mary will give the microphone to the next one, and then after that, just pass the microphone around. You have to come up here now so we can see you and hear you, and then we'll close in just a little bit. But Mary, I'm looking forward to this.
You notice he didn't say anything about me saying anything. Oh, well, grand formation. Dad found this poem and he wanted it on his memorial. It's written by Raymond Cohn. He has called a grand formation, and we are waiting for you here to shout with jubilation and to greet you with a cheer. We have followed you in battle, and you stood by us in peace. Ours is the grandest honor to welcome your release. The earthbounds gently call you, your loved ones cry in pain. Yet understand, brave soldier, the prize which you have gained. You set a fine example upon the earth you trod, a soldier serving nation, a soldier serving God. At times the task grew heavy, and your life was greatly tossed. But our commander won the victory on Calvary, paid the cost. Our ranks are filled with brave souls who defended our great land. The stories they will share with you are wonderful and grand. He prepared for you a billet. It's waiting for you now. So come to us in heaven, while down on earth they bow. There be their heads in silence, praying for strength to face the days, because they'll sorely miss you when you are gone away. Old bugler, play your melody, ever sweet and ever slow. We understand it's here for them, it's bare for them to let this soldier go. We've formed now at the portal with the bright and shining sun, with open arms now beckoning his call. Good soldier, come. Talk about a 2.5 hour.
One of my favorite memories of Dad is the time he and I spent in his shop on many evenings. The shop was an open-faced, kind of a lean-to affair. There wasn't a front door, it was open, and it was second half of the barn. So we're out there usually at night. Summertime sessions in the cool night were a delight. Wintertime sessions were cold and shivery, but no less grand. I don't remember when I became his helper and tool chaser, but countless hours spent together were spent fixing folks' cars. I always was in awe of how surely his hands moved to just the right tool, how he never fumbled a nut or a bolt, always slipped each part into the place it belonged, just like it belonged there. No waste of motion. I rarely had the opportunity to hunt for anything that he dropped. He would explain how things worked and why it's important to take care of what we had. It was easy to see he loved and valued what he was doing. We talked about family and the world, how rain doesn't follow when the wind is out of the east. And we noticed this summer, most of the times it rained when the wind was out of the east. But usually he had it right. How to know when it's time for a tune-up, and how to place a jack in just the right place to safely change tires, how to gap spark plugs, how to use a handyman jack as a come-along, why it's important to learn as much as whatever you can about whatever you do, because you never know when you'll need it or how you might use it someplace else. Where deer can be found, and why the irrigation ditches ran in the direction that they ran. It's more difficult to catch a trout than a catfish. and how hard Mom worked to keep the family running. How to take care of the animals and never, ever forget to feed and water and take care of their needs first. Because we had tamed them, and they no longer were able to do it for themselves. I learned what it was like growing up in western Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl years, and we talked about faith and how important it was for him to have a mother and a grandmother who prayed for him while he was away in the war. He knew without a doubt that's what kept him alive. I learned how he was raised to love God and how he fell away and how God drew him back again. I learned about how important family is and how not to judge their choices, but to pray that God would show me how to love them like God does. The church family and friend family is just as important as the biological family. And that anyone we don't even know yet deserves our respect and kindness because they're people just like us. If we know the right thing to do, he said, don't do it. Excuse me, I skipped a line. Can you hear him saying that? No. If we know the right thing to do and don't do it, there we go, we're just as guilty as if we rebelliously chose to do what we know is wrong. I learned that there's evil in this world, but most folks are good and will do the right thing given the chance. And I learned never to give up on anybody because God doesn't give up on us. Those evening sessions with the cars covered far more than mechanics and taking care of tools in your families. They instilled in me the appreciation of all the goodness in my life and the knowledge that when hard times come, and they do, and they did, they will eventually resolve, and life will go on, probably better than it was before. The past is for remembering, not for lingering. The future just might be pretty amazing. I learned to take none of life's goodness for granted, but to work to make things better where we can. Those shade tree mechanics sessions ended when I graduated from high school, but the lessons of love have never faded. Dad continued to have an interest in his children and loved to help whenever we asked. He delighted in his grandchildren and loved all of his family anyway. I think it truly made him sad when he was no longer physically able to take care of us. He continued to take care of us in his way to the very end. Oh, he wasn't perfect. No one is. But he was perfect for our family. What a privilege to have that man as an example of what I can become. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "The purpose of life is not to be happy." Did you know that? It's not to be happy. It's to be useful, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference where you have lived and lived well. And somebody added on to that, happiness is the byproduct of living a right life.
Well, what can we say about Paul Goble that hasn't been said already? Bill and I were talking. He's like, well, if you get a chance, come over here. And we'll kind of look what we can find in a shed, see if there's anything that you want to keep. And it's not so much the tools, it was the smell. The shop smelled that way. The truck smelled that way. It didn't matter if you were gone 4 years, you'd come back, different truck. The same sweet smell. And as I'm learning here tonight, that it wasn't the smell of the oil, it wasn't the smell of the hand cleaner, it wasn't the smell of the parts on the floor. It was the smell of love, because it was around, it was him. I talked to him one day, and he's like, well, come on over and we'll take a look at the air conditioner in the car. Never heard Grandma and Grandpa argue. One of those things you just didn't hear. They would disappear into the bedroom. So we got the dash tore apart on this minivan. Pretty soon Grandma comes out. Now, Paul, you make sure that Mark does most of that work and not do the heavy stuff. Betty, will you hush and go back in the house? We're working on the car. And I just about hit my knees. I was like, oh my word. But he didn't say it rudely. It was to let her know that he was okay. There's just so many memories I have of him that will just never go away. I had 101 things to say. How do you end a novel? And he passed.
Well, I'm Rhonda Roost Atwood, and a lot of you know who I am. Uncle Paul was also my cousin, and there were 40 years, 30 years difference between our ages. He was my dad's oldest nephew. Or was a cousin, uncle, or nephew. We just had a funky family. Let's just put it that way. But one thing I want to say is, my Uncle Paul called my dad when I was not even a year old and said, I need you to move to Colorado. There's work here. Well, so my dad moved our family, and I was just a year old when we came. And during that time as we grew up, one day I got put in a car when I was little, and I came to Sunday school on 10th grade. And he led me to the Lord. So the feelings in my heart for this man are so deep. He loved us Roost kids like we were his own. If we needed help, even after our dad passed, he was always there. And so his works were mighty for serving the Lord. You know, and some people say that that's not important anymore, but oh, it truly is. Because heaven was where he was headed, and I sure wanted to be there with him.
I've been thinking about how to put all this into words, and I'd had help with Robert and Janet. They shrunk it all down, which was nice. But when I was 4 years old, we moved to Debec, to North Dakota. We would come back to Grand Junction on family vacations. When we would visit, I remember sitting on Grandpa's lap and he would let me drink his coffee. He would say, "Go for it." I was 14 years old when my dad died, and Grandpa took me in as one of his own kids. He helped me as I grew up. You could say that I adopted him as dad. When I was 18, we moved back to Grand Junction, and at times I would walk with him in the mall for exercise. When Carlos and I were dating, Grandpa accepted Carlos as one of his own. He would stick his hand out and they would shake hands. When Carlos and I got married, Grandpa walked me down the aisle. Grandpa had a big heart and loved every one of his grandkids. Jesus showed through him.
I'm unlike the lot of you here. I knew Paul for the shorter end of about 3 days. I'm his great-grandson-in-law. I'm Elizabeth's husband. And I want to share with you an example of the stamp that he would press into the lives of those around him without him even knowing. I came to visit the summer of 2019, and I came to meet this side of the family, and we made about 3 hours of one day specifically to go see Paul at his house. We get there, and Elizabeth warns me. She says, "Hun, be prepared. He's going to talk your ear off the entire time you're in there." So we walk in, we sit down, I introduce myself, and the talking begins. I was in the Marine Corps at the time, so that's the brood of what we talked about. All the stories he would tell. I said maybe 5 words. I just sat and listened. At the end of the conversation, he gifted me 2 pins from one of his hats, and I still have those pins. I think about those pins, and every time I see them in the drawer they're sitting in, I think of all the stories I've heard from Elizabeth, from Robin, from Carla, everybody, and I think, wow, I knew the man for 72 hours, and the honor and pride that I feel to call him my grandfather is unmatched. So, Semper Fidelis, Corporal Paul Goble. We'll miss you.
I'm a horrible public speaker, so please bear with me. Paul Goble is my great-grandfather. My husband was going to be here with me today, but unfortunately my daughter came down with something, so he stayed home with her. My husband's a mechanic, and so my grandfather and him would just talk nonstop about mechanic stuff. My grandfather would gift my husband mechanic books from like the 70s, and it's hilarious because those books are pretty much now and voided. And so, but my husband would gladly accept them, would take them home. We still have them. And so it was just something, same thing. We'd go over there, my children, his great-great-grandchildren, we'd go over there. He'd give them the little mini slim Oreo cookies. And they would just, he loved them so much. It breaks my heart that we didn't get to go over there and spend more time. He's going to be greatly missed. I hope he's up there working on all the cars that he wants, and him and Grandma are just, I'm so happy that they're finally together. And yeah, just I love you, Grandpa, and you're greatly missed. Veronica.
That's funny because that's my daughter Jessica, but Grandpa called her Veronica for a lot of years. As a matter of fact, and it didn't matter how many times we told him that I was Mark's wife, not his daughter, but he kept thinking I was his daughter. And Mark, where's your wife at? I grew up in a very tough, abusive household. And Grandpa was the most soft-spoken man I have ever met in my life. He never raised his voice around us. He just had this calm around him. Just sitting next to him and talking with him filled me with peace. And I just wanted to thank him just for being there. He was such a special man. When Mark was gone, either he was overseas for 7 months at a time and I was home with babies, or he was in North Dakota working and I needed something, Grandpa would come over and help me. And he was just somebody you could count on. You could always count on him to take care of the family and to be there for them. And he was just a special man, and I'm so glad I had him in my life.
I wasn't planning on coming up here, but here I am. Some of my earliest memories of Grandpa Goble is coming over to the house, and the house always smelled so good. It's like Grandma was always cooking something, and Grandpa was in his chair, and I'd go sit on his lap, and I don't know where they got all these National Geographic magazines, but there were, I swear, hundreds of them. And I would open one up and, he would read them to me and, talk to me about all this stuff that, was in these magazines. And some of my favorite memories of him are, coming over and, he would do the talking and I would just listen and be like, tell me about what it was like in the old days before there was TV. I mean, what did you do? That had to have been boring. Nope. It's a lot of hard work. And I remember one story he told me, and maybe the memory's a little skewed, so correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was when he met Grandma Betty. And he saw her broken down on the side of the road. And he came up to try to help her. She didn't need any help. She knew exactly what she was doing. But she let him help anyway because he was pretty cute. And the two hitched it off. And I remember I had a project to do in school for a world board, during the Great Depression. And at first my interview was, with Grandma, and then suddenly I found myself talking for 4 hours with Grandpa. So I ended up doing 2 projects. because there's just so much history. My grandpa was, I just adored that man. And I thank every single one of you guys for being a part of his life, and I appreciate him for being in mine. The last time I saw him was here in this church, and he gave me a big hug and a kiss on the cheek and said, "I love you, don't ever stop learning, and God's there for you, and he's never gone." And I'd like to think that all that learning I did, or, I think he fostered, or at least helped foster that love of learning in me. And I graduated university with a bachelor's degree in sciences and with nursing. I never lost that love of learning. I think Grandpa had a big part in that. Thank you, Grandpa. I love you.
Most of you know me, I'm Orly, and I was so privileged to work with Paul here at the church 20 years ago. He was so respectful of other people. I'm a young mother, 2 little kids to raise, but every time he talked to me, he'd say, "Now, Sister Ninemeyer," he always talked with me with such respect. Your sweet mama would call. Talking about, I'm glad you talked about that boiler room. She'd call and I'd answer the phone. She'd say, "Now, Orly, Paul is not supposed to be climbing any ladders. His doctor told him to stay off the ladders." I'd say, okay. So we'd hang up and I'd go in the handicapped bathroom and go, "Paul, Betty says you're not supposed to be on the ladder." He'd say, "Okay." That was our routine. He was determined, and he had heart trouble for a long time, and he came in one day with this list. He said, "I'm making you a list." And I said, "Oh," he says, "Yep, I've got to go have that heart procedure, and I'm just not going to live through it." And I said, "Paul, God's not done with you yet." And sure enough, in a couple weeks, he'd be back at work fixing sprinkler systems and boilers and air conditioners. But he loved everyone, and he was so respectful, and I miss him.
I am here to vouch that I
Taps is a poem written by Henry Sandifer. An old Marine died last night. He's now at heaven's door. He wasn't lost at sea or on some distant shore, for he died in bed, you see. His age caught up to him. He could no longer reason right or stand upon his limbs. An old Marine died last night. He's now at heaven's door. He wasn't just a kid, you know, but part of the old Corps. 'Twas the 1930s when he first wore those blues and shoes that shine and the eagle globe and anchor on his hat. He wore it just fine. Excuse me. It's hard to read through water. An old Marine died last night. He's now at heaven's door. He had that certain swagger and aplomb as he walked across the floor. Though age had bowed him just a bit, but discipline was still there. But near the end, he had trouble getting out of his chair. An old Marine died last night. He's now at heaven's door. He could tell you of what he'd seen without being a bore, for he had been places from Camp Pendleton to the Pacific Isles, even to the land of China. It's all right there in his files. He's now at heaven's door. He's been a civilian for many years, but he loved that old Corps. Get out your bugle and play taps for this veteran of old. There's one more Marine recruited by God to guard the streets of gold. An old Marine died last night. He's now at heaven's door. He was welcomed there, I'm sure, by other Marines with a mighty roar. He reported for duty with a sharp salute to St. Peter's crew. An old Marine died last night. And now he's with the chosen few.
And we have paid a wonderful tribute and salute to the life of a good man. Whether you've known him 67 years or more, or just a few, or only spent a few days knowing him. And I know what you mean about extra time. I didn't get to talk much either. Usually when I go to a home to make a pastoral call, I'll set aside in my mind about 20 to 30 minutes or so. With Paul, I made sure I had an afternoon, and I enjoyed every minute of it and heard more stories and loved every one of them. He loved to eat. The last time I was with him while he was still conscious, I did visit the day of his death, and he was pretty much out of it, not aware of what was going on. But the last time I visited him, prior to that, I went in right about noon, and there was some food on the plate on the table, and I was teasing him and saying, "I thank you for making lunch for me. I came at noon on purpose." "Oh," he said, "you can have that." "No," I said, "that's yours." He said, "It's all right, that's breakfast." So it's been sitting there all morning, waiting for you. What a man, what a man, what a life. There will be a brief graveside service immediately upon conclusion of this service in a few moments at the Palisades City Cemetery. It's just about 7.5 miles east of us on this same road on the south side. And for those who would like to go, the service there will be brief, perhaps 10 minutes at the longest. And if you would like to stay here, there are some finger foods, and I believe I understand correct, they can go ahead and start nibbling if you wish. Those who stay here, and those who would like to go to the graveside service, you're invited to return here afterwards and join in the nibbling and visiting with one another and continuing to remember and honor the life of a good man. On behalf of the family and of our church, we want to give thanks to Callahan Edfast and their service to this family. And folks, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you and to our pallbearers. And if you'll, Megan, give us direction. Thank you so much for all that you've done for this family.
Can everyone hear me? There we go. I'm so sorry. We'll try a third time. We're going to make a right out of the lot. If you do want to join us as we go together to Palisade, there will be some moments to put a jacket on. We'll make a right out of the lot, a left on Hawthorne, another left on 27 and a half, and finally a left at the light on Patterson. A big old safe circle instead of risking the left right here out of to stay nice and close together. Just a few minute drive. We'll go nice and slow, make a right on into the cemetery, and y'all folks will have plenty of time to gather at the graveside before we take Paul actually to his space. And then pallbearers, if you please could come up to me and aid me in escorting him to our vehicle. Thank you so much, gentlemen.